Hi, everybody. Today is Monday, November 24th, 2025, and our friend, our brother, Carl Jacques is here with us. Welcome back, Carl.
Thank you very much for inviting me again, and happy to be back with you.
Carl, let me start with the case of Ukraine and with the new plan, 28-point plan on the part of the United States. It seems that the government in the United States was happy with somehow somebody published the document, and we know what are the points that have been mentioned in that document. I don't know if it was the United States, Ukrainians, or Russians. But after all, looking at the situation in Ukraine and looking at what Donald Trump is trying to do with Ukraine, he said, I don't know if you saw his point when he was talking. He had a meeting with Mamdani, the new mayor of New York. In the aftermath of that meeting, he was talking about the case of. He was asked by reporters about the case of Ukraine, and he responded. Here is what he said. Go.
Ask you also about this Ukraine plan.
Yeah.
President Zelensky said today that his country would risk either giving up a partner or giving up its dignity. There's been criticism that this deal.
You mean he doesn't like it?
It's unclear. He was sort of
Well,
pretending.
he'll have to like it, and if he doesn't like it, then they should just keep fighting, I guess.
The suggestion that he made, though, was that if he doesn't accept it, that the U.S. would pull back its support for Ukraine.
Well, at some point he's going to have to accept something. He hasn't accepted. You remember right in the Oval Office not so long ago, I said, you don't have the cards. Don't forget, I inherited this war. This war never would have happened. I inherited this war. And I thought he should have made a deal a year ago, 2 years ago. The ultimate deal would have been if it never started. That would have been the good deal. That could have been done too if you had the right president, but you didn't have the right president.
Yeah, I just forgot to say, please subscribe and hit like button because that helps us to reach more people. Carl, when you look at Donald Trump and the way that he's talking about Ukraine, on one side, we see that the government, the administration in the United States is interested. I would say they want to put an end to the conflict in Ukraine as soon as possible. They don't like the conflict in Ukraine. But on the other hand, on the Russian part, they don't want to see a new Minsk II agreement with the United States. What is your take on that?
Well, first of all, I think we have talked many times about this and the whole intellectual process that you have with the Donald Trump decision, because again, he wants to save money. He wants to make America great again. Therefore, he doesn't want to get entangled in endless wars that cost a lot of money, that prevent research and development, developing education, infrastructure, and all that in your own country. So I can understand the basic move of getting away from all these endless and extremely expensive wars, both in terms of lives, but also in terms of finance. So this is the first thing, and Donald Trump is a businessman. He wants to restore the power of the U.S. Again, we can argue against or in favor of that. The fact is that it is his policy. That's the first point. The second point is that he doesn't want to leave Ukraine because obviously the Ukrainian conflict is a conflict that has been triggered, started, initiated, and fed by the US, especially during the Biden administration. And this conflict has become, and I could say under the Biden administration, has become almost a private war between the Biden family and Russia. And there is a point where you don't see exactly what can be reached. There was an idea of weakening Russia. Okay, why not? But once you see that it doesn't work, once you see that all the sanctions you put are doing the exactly opposite effect, why do you continue? That's the second thing. And the Trump realized this, that it's a pointless war at this stage, at least. And the third point is that, and probably Donald Trump realized this when you had the recent reports of what is going on in Pokrovsk, in Kupiansk, and all that. And he probably understood that the picture that he received from the conflict, from Zelensky and his aides, that you had a discrepancy between the reports on the ground and what Zelensky was saying. Therefore, he probably felt that it was deceived by the Zelensky administration. And in that, he also realized that Ukraine was not on the path of victory, that victory has never been defined seriously by Ukraine, nor by the Europeans, by the way, nor by the US, by the way. And beyond the idea of victory, the idea of defeating Russia has never been defined either, meaning that nobody knows exactly what we want to achieve with this conflict. And what we see on the ground, especially since 1 year, is that the Russians are dominating the battlefield. And again, recently, I mean, a couple of weeks ago, you had the French foreign minister saying, well, Russia is not winning, it's defeated because in 1 year it only achieved to gain 1% of the Ukrainian territory. And that's the vision that we have mostly in the West, that because Russia doesn't win or gain territory, it is therefore losing because the Ukrainians are stronger. But the reality is more subtle than this. Because remember what Vladimir Putin said on the 24th of February 2022. He said, the aim is demilitarization. He added denazification, but demilitarization. Demilitarization, the idea was to have a weaker Ukrainian army, and a weaker Ukrainian army that could not attack or affect or harm the Russian population in Ukraine. Therefore, there had to be some kind of demilitarization. Now, I told you what the French foreign minister said. He said in 1,000 days, the Russian didn't manage to win more than 1% of Ukrainian territory. If you look at what happened in the 1,000 days, and I counted, I went on a website that is a Ukrainian website that counts, but again, we have to take it extremely with precaution because it's a count that is partly with algorithms and all that. So I don't take that as a perfect count of Ukrainian casualties, but at least this is something we have. And this website, it's called wartears.org. If you look in the 1,000 last days, Ukrainians have lost more than 600,000 people. Soldiers, I mean. 600,000 killed. Meaning that when you you remember what Putin said, the problem was not territory. It was about destroying a potential. So it's not about the percentage or square kilometers. It's about the number of killed people. We don't know exactly how many Ukrainians have been killed, how many soldiers have been killed. That's the reason why I referred to this website, wartears.org. And again, it is more than 600,000 that have been killed, meaning that, in fact, despite what we think in the West, Russia is winning on the ground, is achieving its objectives. Because at the end of the day, what decides if you win or if you lose, this depends on the objectives you have set at the beginning. If you have set ambitious objectives and you cannot reach them, you can say, well, okay, that was too ambitious. You were not successful. If you had the right objective, you managed to reach it, then you were successful. Period. It's as simple as that. The problem is that the West has never acknowledged the objectives that were set by the Russians, and instead they have defined their own objectives, such as to take over the whole of Ukraine, to replace the the government in Kiev by toppling the government and things like this, which objectives that have never been stated by anyone in Russia. So, but these are the Western objectives, so that you can say, well, they didn't reach the objective, therefore they lose. They are loser. The objectives set by the Russians were in fact extremely realistic, tragically realistic, you can say, but realistic. And the fact of the matter is that when you look at the battlefield today, Russia is winning. Therefore, and you have to think about this situation. And the more we wait, the less likely it is that Ukraine will win in some way. Therefore, it's less likely that Russia will be defeated. Therefore, there is a point where you have to make a decision. And in the light of what you want to achieve, if you say, well, we want Russia to be entangled in an endless war, then you continue the war. But if you say, well, we want to preserve Ukraine because we want to defend or protect or whatever, we support Ukraine, therefore there is a point where this conflict must cease. And this is exactly the calculus of the Trump administration. It contradicts the policy of the US up to now, but in fact, this is the most rational decision you can take. And when you talk about this 28-point document that was leaked, and we can probably talk about it later, but if you compare it with the proposal that was made by the Europeans, you can see that there's a huge difference in this. And the difference is that you see that the Europeans are not aiming at reaching an agreement. They continue on the same path they have been. They must confront Russia. And just a couple of days ago, Kaja Kallas, who is the foreign minister of the European Union, or the high representative for foreign action of the European Union, she said Europe has a 2-point plan: defeat Russia and support Ukraine. I mean, point 1 is defeat Russia. Point 2 is support Ukraine. I mean, we all agree that Kaja Kallas is not the brightest light in the shop. Everybody understands that. Nevertheless, that shows exactly the mood in which the Europeans are when it comes to this conflict. This has become extremely emotional. This has always been emotional, by the way. This is strongly driven by, we can even say, Russophobia that you can see in the Baltic states and in Poland. These are the real drivers of the conflict, if you look at the European side. And it's probably not a coincidence if Kaja Kallas, who used to be the very unsuccessful prime minister of a country that is one of the smallest of the European Union, is now in charge of the foreign policy of the European Union. She was not able to manage a 1.3 million people country, and now she's not even managing the foreign policy of almost 400 million people in Europe. So we see that the simple fact that we selected or decided to have Kaja Kallas as Foreign Minister of the European Union shows exactly where the European Union is heading to. At no point in this conflict, at no point, the European Union has been able to provide any kind of diplomatic or political solution to the conflict. They didn't even try. And it's very interesting, by the way, because we had this, as I said, the 20-point plan, the American proposal or document that was published end of last week. And yesterday, on Sunday, the Europeans have produced their own plan. But it's interesting, when you look at this plan, they just took the American plan, and they just amended the point, meaning that they don't even have their own view on that. They just amended the points that didn't suit them. They just amended on the American document, meaning that they have absolutely no capacity to have their own view on this conflict. They have to take the American view as basis. In addition to that, we have seen recently, especially when we have those different meetings of the so-called coalition of the willing, and you had the meeting, I remember, in London. After the meeting in London, they published a joint statement saying that they welcome active diplomacy. And we're talking about the Americans, obviously, because even though the Europeans welcome active diplomacy to solve the conflict, the Europeans have not activated anything in terms of diplomacy. They have cut all the communication channels with Russia, and they never made any effort whatsoever to restore this channel of communication. I mean, the diplomatic channel of communication. At least what you had just after Donald Trump came into power earlier this year, the first step they started, it was to reinstall a normal diplomatic relationship between the US and Russia, to restore the embassies personnel and all that, to establish kind of a legal framework to reestablish this communication. And based on that, then you had all the discussions we had since then. But first, you have to restore those relationships. The Europeans have not even tried to do that. That means that today, the Europeans are completely cut off of the Russians. And they won't, and that's the interesting point, because after the Trump plan was published or leaked, better said, Europeans said, well, we should be involved in the process. But for what reason? What is exactly the role of European Union? We can say the Americans, for good or bad reasons, they are the mediators in this conflict. I agree this is quite strange, but there is the intellectual explanation for that. Or the Trump administration is saying, well, that was Biden's war, that will be Trump's peace. Okay, fair enough. This is quite strange if you look at US as an entity, and okay, but I can follow the reasoning of Trump saying, well, that was not my war, I didn't want it. That's exactly what he said, by the way, in the short video you showed. This is not my war, I didn't want it, so no, I can take the role of mediation. Okay, fair enough. And therefore, they are involved in the discussion between Ukrainians and Russians. But what is exactly the role of Europeans? They are not mediator, obviously, and they say they are not involved in a conflict. I mean, they are supporting actively through rhetoric, narrative, finance, military equipment, and so on and so forth. They support, but they say, well, we are not part of the conflict. And now they want to be part of the negotiation. So you see, we are here in some kind of, again, we are beyond a realistic approach from the Europeans. They are completely emotional. They are completely irrational since the very beginning of the conflict. And they are not even able to understand what is at stake in the conflict. And I would even suggest that they deliberately want to ignore what is at stake for both parties in the conflict. They make their war with others. And that's the reason why they would like to have the Americans still involved in Europe, because they prefer the Americans to be involved in the conflict rather than themselves. That's also the reason why they support Ukraine when they say, for instance, that they use Ukraine. And remember, again, Kaya Kallas, what she said just a couple of days ago, again, and I think that was the same day in which she said the previous quotation I made. but to say quote, I mean, she said, it's a good bargain to support Russia. I mean, it's a better bargain to support Ukraine than having a Russian victory. Meaning that it's exactly what Lindsey Graham was saying. It's a good deal to wage war against Russia through Ukraine because we don't spend any American life. We just spend money. That's fine. That's a good bang for the buck. And that's exactly what you have in Europe. I mean, they don't want to get involved themselves, but they would prefer others, the Ukrainians and the US, because the idea is to weaken Russia. They have not the slightest intent to support. I would even say they don't have even respect for the Ukrainian population. They just want to harm Russians. And when you listen to those Baltic states and all that, they talk so much about Ukraine. The most important for them is to weaken Russia. And that's what you can say just looking at the whole process of these two documents. I would say two documents because you have the US plan and the European counter proposal. So that shows exactly the weakness, the intellectual, political, diplomatic weakness of Europe in all that. And I think that should worry people seriously, because they achieve nothing and they are not able to achieve anything. That's the first point. And they don't even understand the situation. They don't even understand they cannot achieve anything with their policy. So again, this is tragic to some extent, because at the end of the day, Ukrainians are paying the price for this.
Carl, when it comes to the critical points of the 28 plan, one of them is the cap on the military size of Ukraine, which is 600,000. When it's so sensitive for Russians, because after we are approaching 4 years of the conflict with the war in Ukraine, and they're talking about 600,000 soldiers being again prepared in Ukraine, or being the future of Ukraine, be somehow supporting this sort of mindset to have a large army. And what does that mean for Russia, in your opinion? Is that the same thing as because with the case of the Minsk II, they didn't have this sort of discussion. It's all about the eastern part of Ukraine, but right now Russia's mindset has totally changed toward Ukraine. I don't know if that is appreciated even by the Trump administration.
Well, there are different things here. First of all, when we talk about the numbers, 600 was supposed to be a reduction of the forces, and I have seen different figures. I'm not sure people understood. I don't. First of all, we have also to say that apparently different versions of this 28-point plan. When I looked at the plan, I looked at the version that was published by the Financial Times on last Friday, on the 21st. But there are other versions. There's another version that has been published by a Ukrainian MP, Gosharenko, which differs significantly from the American version. But I don't know exactly. We have also to acknowledge and probably to admit that those documents are not the final document, but are probably working documents, like so-called non-paper that are used for people to develop some ideas and probably to develop argument and things like that. So I think this is a document, a working paper, and we should take it in that way. In any case, I have heard that, for instance, Ukrainian army have reduced by 40%. Now I see this the figure of 600,000, and if you look at the reduction 40%, and as a result 600,000, that means that Ukraine had an army of 1 million. If you remember well, this is what Zelensky claimed several times, that he had a 1 million army, and he wanted to have this 1 million army to destroy or to reach the Azov Sea, and to destroy the Russians, to repel the Russians, and so on and so forth. So this is probably all that comes from this, I would say, assumption, because in fact there is absolutely no document that shows that the Ukrainian army has ever reached the level of 1 million. Therefore, this reduction to 600,000 is for me a complete fantasy. The Ukrainian army, to my knowledge, and if you look at the Warties organization website that I mentioned before, it gives the stand of the active force of the Ukrainian army, and essentially you see that the Ukrainian army has barely gone beyond 450,000 during the war, meaning that if we would reduce that, we come to, by half, let's say, we would reach a level of 220,000 or something like that. So 600,000 is extremely exaggerated. But again, more interesting is to see what the Europeans suggest for the army, and they suggest 800,000. So that shows exactly the mood of the Europeans in that. They don't want to solve the problem. They want to exacerbate the problem. And you see that this is, and again, I'm from, yes, I have an intelligence background, and I certainly apply intelligence method when I do analysis and things like this. But I assume all these governments have also intelligence agencies, intelligence services, intelligence analysis services that are able to say how many people you have in the Ukrainian army, A, and B, what is at stake during this conflict. And by saying that the Ukrainian army should have a maximum of 800,000 soldiers in peacetime. That means that those guys, they don't want to go towards peace. It's definitely a provocation against the Russians. And here you see exactly what strikes me in all that. This is the spirit, the mood, the mindset of those who are supposed to help to solve a crisis. They have, in fact, absolute intention whatsoever to solve the crisis. On the contrary, they want to exacerbate it. And that's, I think, extremely worrisome. So this is what I can say about these figures. They're obviously exaggerated. I don't know what should be the right number. Again, there is also something that we have to say, because this document, as I said, in my view, and because you have different versions of the document, I have the firm feeling that this is only a working document. But, and incidentally, I think we have talked about the frozen assets a few weeks ago or something like that. In any case, in the discussion about the frozen assets, the Belgian Prime Minister said, well, how can we define what we do with these assets? Because if you have an agreement between Russia and Ukraine, usually the winner says what he wants to do with all that. So if suddenly we decide to do something with a frozen asset and the Russians say something else, that means we are trapped and we will have to repay the Russians without any discussion. Meaning that among the Europeans, some understand that we are heading towards a victory of the Russians. And in that case, The Russians will define exactly what are the conditions. You can say all the figures you want today. At the end of the day, when the Russians win, they will say, well, we if you don't want to talk, if you don't accept our terms, we continue the war. And in fact, that's exactly what Vladimir Putin said just, I think it was on Friday, during the meeting of the Russian Security Council, where he said, well, if the Ukrainians refuse the agreement or refuse to negotiate, that's something that suits us, because then we'll continue with military operation and we'll achieve our objective through military force. So we are not worried. The whole rationale behind these agreements and the conditions set by the Europeans, all that is based on the assumptions that the Russians are losing much more than the Ukrainians. And therefore, we can afford to put conditions, because the Russians have no choice but to accept what we say, because they are losing much. But the reality of the matter is that, and I think everybody now, I mean, not the journalists, not the politicians, not the so-called political elites in Europe, but if you talk about really professionals, those who have, let's say, a solid understanding of the conflict, in intelligence and things like this, everybody understands that Ukraine is losing much more than the Russians. We cannot say exactly what is the ratio of losses, but definitely Ukrainians are losing more than the Russians. They are definitely losing more lives than the Russians. They are definitely losing more equipment than the Russians. They are definitely losing more territory than the Russians, and things like this. So meaning that the Russians, there is no, and that's exactly, by the way, what Donald Trump said in the small video you showed. Zelensky has no cards. The Europeans have no cards. So when you have no cards, you should make every incentive to attract the Russians into the agreement, not to make the agreement unattractive. Because at the end, that's exactly what Putin says. Well, if they don't want, then for us, continue. If we continue the military operation. That's fine with us, because we can afford it. And that's where you see this intellectual weakness that we have in the European polity at large.
Carl, somehow what's going on in Ukraine is the same sort of mindset that is shaping in Europe, which is the militarization of Europe. Because if you're interested in having a Ukrainian sovereign country called Ukraine, in the western part of Ukraine, the central part of Ukraine, you have to consider that 800,000 soldiers, how you can feed this army, what is the plan? Because the future of Ukraine doesn't get anywhere with this sort of mindset.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. You're absolutely right. I mean, but again, it illustrates the delusion that in which the Europeans are. Today, we have to admit that the Americans have realized that the war cannot continue that way, because otherwise they will lose big, and the defeat will be so obvious that it will be politically extremely heavy for everybody, not just for the Ukrainians, but also for all those who promoted to continue the war. So we are in this kind of situation, and therefore you have, and it's interesting because instead of having some kind of, let's say, afterthoughts, or try to think about the problem, try to identify new ways of solving the problems, new solutions, new proposals, and all that. Instead of that, you have Europe tends to be even more radical in its approach. And that was exemplified just a couple of days ago by the declaration of the French chief of the army. It's the equivalent of the Joint Chief of Staff, of the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff in the U.S. It's the Chief of Staff of the armed forces in France, General Fabien Mandon. And he said that every family in France should be prepared to sacrifice his children. And that triggered an outrage in the whole political spectrum in France, and also among citizens, because they said, well, what are they talking about? France is not at war with Russia. We are far away from Ukraine. We are allegedly not part of the conflict. We don't see, and we cannot identify any reason, rationale, or objective for Russia to attack France. So what are they talking about? And that reflects also this mood that was triggered by Ursula von der Leyen when she said that Europe should militarize, and she had this in fact big project to remilitarize Europe. And again, if you think about it, what is the rationale behind this? There's absolutely none. This is only fed by the narrative that Russia attacked Ukraine for no reason and wanted just to expand its own territory. And therefore, once it started with Ukraine, why not continuing with the Baltic states, with Poland, and so on and so forth. So it's based on a narrative that has been found or developed exclusively in the West, that the Russians have never mentioned in any way. And even more, the Russians have explicitly said why they entered Ukraine. But since nobody wants to acknowledge the real reasons for the Russians to enter Ukraine, of course, then if you exclude that, then you have all other reason to recreate the Tsarist Empire, the Soviet Union. You can find any kind of explanation. And that's exactly where we are. And that's extremely disturbing because, again, I come from the strategic intelligence. Strategic intelligence is precisely this area of intelligence that advises decision makers. I mean, the highest decision makers, namely ministers, governments, and things like that. This is the purpose of strategic intelligence. Now, who advised those people? Who advised them? Who advised the French chief of staff for saying that the French should prepare for war? Who advised him? This is extremely that shows profound dysfunction within the defense apparatus, the inability to understand the threat as it is. And we can expand this kind of comment in saying that we have underestimated Russia for years, and certainly in the last 3 years we have severely underestimated Russian capabilities. We've underestimated their ability to fight. We've underestimated their potential, their military potential, their economic potential, their ability to maintain diplomatic relationship with the rest of the world. Russia is not isolated whatsoever. It's isolated from the West, but not from the rest of the world, while the West has become isolated from the rest of the world. And we see that we are not discussing that today. That goes beyond the discussion, but the whole issue of de-dollarization and all that goes exactly in the direction of the rest of the world trying to escape the threat of economic sanctions and so on from the West, meaning that the gap between the rest of the world and the West is growing, while Russia, on the other hand, has expanded its network, expanded its relationship with the rest of the world, not even mentioning China, which is obviously the most powerful country in the world today. So we see that the West has constantly underestimated the Russia, the rest of the world, including China, by the way. But they make decision on that. Again, if your taxi driver underestimated Russia, you say, okay, think what you want, no problem. But when you have strategic decision makers that start to make such kind of strategic mistakes in underestimating a country such as Russia, then you would say there is something wrong. There is profound dysfunction within our establishments at large. Because there must be someone in the whole system that says, well, stop, we are going in the wrong direction. But in Europe, it doesn't seem to affect the rationale of economic or political decisions. You have this, of course, you can add in Europe, you have an additional factor, which is a complicating factor. You have the Greens and environmentalists and all that complicate the whole thing. And that's also a big problem in Germany and other countries. In any case, the fact of the matter is that we see that the European economy is going down. Companies are closing down. You have more unemployment. You have more inflation. Everything goes wrong. The budget deficit is growing in all these countries, and we still want to continue to support Ukraine in a conflict for which we have no objective. If you consider that weakening, but even weakening Russia is not working, because we see that Russia, on the contrary, is improving. And that's the reason why in March this year you had it's because you have also that in the 20-point agreement, by the way, that the sanctions will be relieved from Russia. But if you listen to what Vladimir Putin said in March this year during the Congress, the annual Congress of the industrialists and other, I don't remember, entrepreneurs, he said, well, the sanctions are systemic against Russia. The West wants to weaken us, and therefore they will keep these sanctions in some way. Therefore, we need to learn to live with those sanctions. And we in fact, and he said also, that's very interesting, by the way, he said, in fact, the sanctions have prompted us to improve. And it's interesting because we see today, for instance, what you see in China, you have this struggle between US and China regarding semiconductors, and US has issued a ban to provide some semiconductors to China. And now that US is losing the battle, they start to reauthorize the supply of some kind of semiconductors to China. But now it's China who is banning Western semiconductors. Why that? Because the Chinese have understood that because if you cannot import semiconductors, that helps your own industry to find solution for that. It prompts creativity. It supports the idea of innovation, trying to find new ways, and the Chinese have been extremely, by the way, creative in finding new solutions to bypass the ban of lithography machines and all that. Meaning that the sanctions can probably do some harm at the beginning, but it also helps a country that has resources, and Russia is a country with resources. China is a country with resources, meaning that as long as it's more convenient to buy a finished product instead of developing it, you do it. But if you cannot buy it, then you have to produce it. And that's a stimulus for the economy. That's a stimulus for the industry. This is a stimulus for research and development. And therefore, in fact, Russia benefited from the sanctions. You cannot just see the sanctions just at face value. You have to understand exactly what are the implications of that. And the Russians have, and Vladimir Putin in particular, has perfectly understood that the sanctions are not a punishment, they are an opportunity. And that's exactly what he said in March this year, meaning that when you try to attract Russia into an inconvenient agreement with Ukraine by saying, well, we will relieve the sanctions, Russia said, well, we're not very interested because we have developed other tools. We have developed other solutions. And in fact, the sanctions are stimulating our economy. In fact, they're doing some positive effects. So we see here that on the Western side, we have an extremely simplistic understanding of the relationships with Russia, and with others as well. It's not limited to Russia. I mean, I mentioned China just to take an example, but in fact, the relationship between Europe and China is exactly the same. The relationship between US and China suffers exactly from the same problem. We tend to underestimate the capabilities of others. We tend to look at the problems just as face values, and therefore to ignore what is really at stake behind this. While the others, and if you travel to Russia or to China, you will see people are extremely educated. The average level of individual is extremely high, much higher than the West, by the way, and probably much higher than our political leaders. That's not difficult, by the way. So we see that these countries have a huge potential, and therefore, for them, you cannot just attract them with simplistic measures. You have to go deeper than this, and that's exactly what this plan shows. And for that reason, I think the Russians have understood. By the way, that's also what Vladimir Putin said on Friday to the National Security Council. He said, well, this document is a good base for discussion. That's it. I think the Russians are very aware of the fact that this document cannot be taken just one-to-one like this. It has to be reworked. It has to be negotiated. And every single point needs to be discussed between the parties, namely Russia and Ukraine, under the mediation of the US. And that, I think, it's an accepted fact. But this cannot be just accepted like this. This is just a basis for discussion. And I think the Russians have perfectly understood that. While in the West, we tend to understand this document as a finished document. It's not the case, and the Russians certainly don't understand it that way.
Yeah, exactly. Carl, thank you so much for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
That was my pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me again. Thank you.